Hello, I am Tara Brabazon and welcome to The Post 2. And our second instalment is titled The Peter Principle. So we're going to investigate this fantastically interesting and complex and controversial concept shortly. But firstly, I want to ask you a provocative, nay cheeky series of questions. Firstly, have you ever looked at a leader in an organisation with the shiny suit and the big hair, and you ponder how that person actually has the skills to do their own laundry rather than run an organisation? Have you ever looked in our universities and seen a dean without a doctorate and wonder how that happened? Have you ever looked at the annual list of people who are promoted in an organisation, and you look at the people that were promoted and you look at the people that missed out and you wonder how that happened? We're going to provide some answers to that today through the Peter Principle. But we're in a challenging time for the world right now. We do have a series of deans in our universities who have got these jobs without a PhD. We've got very senior managers in higher education making very important life decisions about teaching and learning, and they have no qualifications in education of any kind. Similarly, we've got people speaking about research excellence and research achievement, and when we review their research career, we don't see an embarrassment of riches, we just see an embarrassment. Okay, it is amazing, and I have been studying this, it is amazing how many leaders in our universities have not rendered their Google Scholar profile public because they know they've failed to achieve the standards in research that they are demanding of others. So hypocrisy is also being added to this marinade of underperformance. So today we're going to talk about why mediocrity proliferates and why incompetence is promoted. And yes, we're going to explore how and why this happens through the Peter Principle. Now, the Peter Principle was written by Dr. Laurence Peter, the Peter Principle of the name, and a great journalist of the time, Raymond. Now, they published this book called The Peter Principle in 1969. Now, that date's going to become important in a second. Look, it has a lot of sort of a bit of a 60s vibe to it, man. A bit of a sort of Mad Men fingertips all over it, really. There's sadly and unfortunately a major swirl of homophobia through the book, bless. And there's also, of course, profound sexism, because women are not involved in the Peter Principle because women don't really work and women are not really promoted. Obviously, because women only work until they wait for a bloke to turn up that they can marry. Okay, so besides the sexism and the homophobia, what have the Romans ever done for us? No, besides the sexism and the homophobia, they're huge caveats, so they are profound weaknesses of the argument. But let's look at the context of this time. And the weird thing is the focus on heterosexual men in the workplace has rendered quite a simple and clean argument. And that's helpful to us as those of us who have come all these decades later start to take the Peter Principle and walk around with it in our time. So let's see how many of these ideas we can transpose into our contemporary institution and organisations. So Laurence Peter and Raymond Hull invented a science to frame their concept, which they described as, quote, the science of hierarchiology. Hierarchiology. Yes, it is a joke, by the way, so hierarchiology. They were drawn to study incompetence and why incompetent people succeed. He recognised that education is not the salve or the solution to incompetence. Indeed, Dr. Peter states, quote, incompetence runs riot in the halls of education, end of quote. And schools and universities provide a lot of examples for his book. Now, I think we still remain shocked by incompetence. I think there's a reason through our sociology and socialisation for that, because when we're children, we're taught to respect people in authority. So our parents, teachers, religious leaders, prime ministers, presidents and so forth. We are taught that people in positions of power are worthy of respect. But the Peter Principle demonstrates why this is actually a mistake. Studying hierarchies, Dr. Peter states, quote, employees are promoted from positions of competence to incompetence, end of quote. He states, quote, in every hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence, end of quote. So we see it in governments, we see it in religious organisations, we see it in schools and universities. So that final promotion for workers moves us all from competence to incompetence. So the successful work, the successful effort in an organisation is completed by people who have not been promoted to their level of incompetence. Now, using this incredibly provocative turn of phrase, Dr. Peter states, and I try not to laugh when I say this, so I apologise, Dr. Peter states, quote, in every hierarchy, the cream rises until it sours, end of quote. Look, it is a great argument. It's an incredibly naughty argument, can I say? It's very, very funny, and it's meant to be. But there are sub-arguments that explain what's happening in our universities in particular. Now, Dr. Peter argues that the competence of an employee, this is important, the competence of an employee is not determined by outsiders. So regulatory bodies, policies, laws, government. No. Competence is determined by the person who is the boss. So the person who is the superior in the hierarchy is the person who determines competence. Right. Now, so in our universities, that's incredibly serious, because it means the international standards of teaching and learning are less important than what the boss thinks of them. So this is going to be really important when we think about the role of chancellors in our hierarchy, chancellors and their role in our organisations. Now, chancellors we rarely think about in universities, but they have one job. Yeah, one job. Chancellors have one job, and that is to appoint a vice-chancellor. And we're going to return here in a sec. But because promotion and indeed hiring is based on what a boss thinks about a worker, really competent, brilliant, productive people are not only not hired, but they're also not promoted, because you're ahead of me, the boss doesn't like them. So Dr. Peter shows, and this is horrifying, that the super competent, so people who really know what they're doing, never make it through this hierarchy and never get through to be a person in power. So the super competent disrupt the hierarchy and are therefore removed from it. So to understand these sorts of workplaces and how power operates in them, it requires focus, therefore, on an employee's relationship, if you like, the relationship of a worker in the hierarchy, who is above them and who is below them. And that's the study. In many ways, the Peter Principle is a study of hierarchy. And, you know, this is the foundation of patronage. I think we all know this. If you get on with your boss, you're going to get on. So Dr. Peters studied that cliche. So if you get on with your boss, you get on. He studied that cliche, and he found it to be accurate. So indeed, the people who have done the hard yakka in self-improvement, so the people who have gone on and done professional development, they have greater difficulty in being promoted because they're more competent than the people that they're moving through and around in the hierarchy. So this has been described by Peters as, quote, the pathology of success, end of quote. Wow. So when finally promoted into a position of incompetence, particular strategies are used to maintain that role, because you're incompetent, you're in a role and you're incompetent at it. So how do you therefore maintain power? And there are strategies that are used. Firstly, the promotion of one's self-image. So the focus on form, not content. So, sending a lot of tweets and blogs out, getting a lot of nice pictures done, putting a hard hat on, bit of high-vis gear and looking earnest, right? So a lot of focus on self-image and branding will hold your position. Secondly, spend a lot of time on really minor issues. So instead of focusing on the grunty stuff, so in universities, teaching and learning and research, you sort of focus on minor stuff like buildings or gardens or, oh wow, I wonder if we need to focus on the logo. Let's spend a lot of money on thinking about the logo, right? Then you know you're in a troubled university or any organisation. And thirdly, you're endlessly preparing to do something. So you know those people that endlessly write strategic plans, operational plans, I love these, vision statements. I'm just off to write a vision statement, right? Okay, so what's happening is this group of people endlessly prepare for the work they're gonna do rather than actually doing the work. And that's because they're operating at a level of incompetence. Right, so by the way, this story ends with what they call the Peter Plateau. So once you hit the level of incompetence, you are trapped there and you stay there. Okay, so this book clearly was a form of satire at the time. It was very funny at the time. But Raymond and Laurence Peter knew they were onto something. And again, the readers knew they were onto something. So it was funny, but it was also accurate, and that's why the satire was so cutting and it's travelled through time. Because the humour was created because the readers could recognise the truth of their argument. Now, since 1969, this phenomenon has been studied in the refereed literature, and some great and funny research has also been created in response. So I particularly wanted to log a brilliant 2019 study by Alan Benson, Danielle Lee and Kelly Shue. Fantastic paper. And they investigated 219 US-based organisations. And they confirmed endlessly that all these organisations promote people into managerial positions based on their performance in the previous position rather than their ability to lead and manage in the new position. So these workers were promoted and then performed badly as leaders and managers. And I should also log the truly legendary Scott Adams. You know that name because he's the wonderful man that invented Dilbert. And of course he created his version of the Peter Principle, which was of course the Dilbert Principle, and he argued that incompetent employees are promoted into managerial positions so that we can get them out of the workflow, so they can stop other people from, not being able to do their job. So when we create managers, we actually allow other people to get on with their work. Now, I find all these arguments absolutely hilarious. When I'm in the queue at a grocery shop, I think about the Peter Principle and I laugh. Okay, it is funny, and it's funny because it's so accurate. But what I would say is the Peter Principle has a very serious role in higher education. And to explain the role of the Peter Principle in higher education, I'm going to use the work of the legendary Stanley Arnowitz. Now, as you know, I'm obsessed by this book. It's one of my favourite books of all time. So Stanley Arnowitz wrote The Knowledge Factory in the year 2000. And he argued that higher education now has 3 tiers, or indeed pathways: teaching, research, and administration. So the scholars who fail, the scholars who underperform in teaching and in research, enter the 3rd pathway, that is administration. So enters the Peter Principle. The incompetent in teaching and research are promoted into administration. So these incompetent academics rule over academics who have been successful in the fields in which they have failed. Okay, so great argument, and therefore let's have a think about the consequences of that argument right now, today. So we've seen it's been 22 years since Stanley Arnowitz published The Knowledge Factory. Let's think about whether he was right and walk this argument around. So let's think about now. Let's think about now. So what's happened through promoting incompetent researchers and incompetent teachers into management and leadership roles in our universities for 20 years? Right, well, let's do the list. What's happened? What's happened in the last 20 years? Endless restructures, money being put ahead of people day after day after day, minor side projects becoming much more important than the core business of teaching and research, casualised teaching contracts, indeed casualised universities, research and service being placed into a very narrow category of what is of benefit to industry. So what is research? That which is of benefit to industry, narrowly defined. And of course, profound instability and inelegant daily decision making. We also see incredibly bizarre appointments. I have a folder on my computer where I collect the bizarre appointments. My friends around the world send me the bizarre appointments and I collect them up. So what's happening is incompetent people have been promoted. And as Dr. Peter confirmed, when incompetent people are promoted, they put other incompetent people around them. So incompetent leaders have incompetent subordinates. So we now have higher education leadership structures that are saturated with incompetent, mediocre, underperforming people who confuse meetings with productive work and confuse restructures with judicious financial management. So what makes this situation so incredibly depressing is that this incompetent leadership tier has created an enormous casualised precariat workforce. So the incompetent are not even allowing the competent to have a permanent position. So they never have a chance to be promoted into incompetence. How has this happened, right? Well, what we have to do is we need to look at vice-chancellors. Actually, that's wrong. We don't need to look at vice-chancellors. We need to look at who hires vice-chancellors. And it does vary in systems around the world, but most systems have an academic council configuration that is chaired by a person that's called a chancellor. Now, chancellors should be a ceremonial role. And look, they mostly are, right? But they have one big job. And that one big job is to chair the committee that hires vice-chancellors. Can I say they also have a second job, that they reappoint those vice-chancellors to a second term. Now, in the old days, chancellors were configured often from the ranks of emeritus professors, right? You know, the historians, the poets, the mathematicians, right? The fantastic old guys who had this great vision of the world, you know, society, they had a sense about how things operate. You know, they often had a beard, looked a lot like Gandalf, right? So when you put the robes and the ceremonial gear on them, they looked fantastic, right? So it was just really great. Now, sadly, Gandalfs have gone, and now our chancellors are filled from a very, very narrow band of industries, nay, businesses. And they have very different demands and expectations of a vice-chancellor. So qualifications, teaching and research excellence are not really their focus. Academic expertise is not really in their list of competencies. Indeed, Vice-Chancellors now are being hired without a PhD. Now, this is absolutely extraordinary, right? Because I wouldn't hire a junior lecturer, I wouldn't hire a tutor in my course if they didn't have a PhD. Yet Vice-Chancellors are being hired without doctorates, and yes, it's about to get worse. Vice-Chancellors are hired without teaching qualifications. So they're meant to have the quality assurance and governance of educational design, educational assessment, to go through quality assurance iterations, right? Create learning and teaching cultures. And of course, Vice-Chancellors are supposedly about enabling all the research in all the disciplines, and yet they're often research inactive upon appointment. We all understand you become a Vice-Chancellor, you become research inactive. It's a big job. But how about you be research active when you're appointed? So what's going on here? And of course the answer is the Peter Principle when we read it through Stanley Arnowitz's The Knowledge Factory. So Vice-Chancellors are promoted to their level of incompetence. There are thousands of examples I can use to verify this case. But what I'm going to do, because I'm classy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the true story of a Vice-Chancellor that's no longer a Vice-Chancellor that was hired in this way. And I've used this example because the Chancellor was called on the decision. So journalists went, what exactly have you done, right? So in public, he had to justify why he made this decision. So therefore, because it's public information, I will report it to you. Now, we all know universities have always been institutions of patronage. White men hired other white men who went to Yale or Sydney or Cambridge, right? But this mode of patronage that I'm talking about now is really different. There is intent and there is will in hiring underqualified people with experiences a long, long way outside of scholarship. Now, such appointments are justified because they're, quote unquote, about management. Oh yes, Tara, teaching research, that's fine, but Vice-Chancellors, it's really about management. Now, what's happened is neoliberal management has eaten up our standards, our commitment to teaching and learning, and excellence in writing, in research, and in scholarship. Now, I saw the Peter Principle with starkness a few years ago when I was going through and studying the RMIT website, and I saw their Vice-Chancellor described as Mr. Bean. And I went, how cruel. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean, minis, Mr. Bean. And I went, no, that can't be right. And actually, you know, I thought, what is it? And it was actually Mr. Martin Bean, not Dr. Bean, Mr. Bean. And yes, he does not hold a doctorate, and he had not been a professor in any university anywhere in the world. So instead, I was thinking, what qualification would he have? No doctorate. He didn't, I thought he might have a business degree. Didn't have an MBA. The only qualification he had, hang on to yourself, was a Bachelor of Education from UTS, University Technology, Sydney. He'd also been the Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, which was also a surprise, and that was described in the British papers as, quote, the first non-academic to hold this role. Now, his previous work experience included working at Microsoft and MOOC development. Oh, great. So how did this happen? Well, RMIT, like many universities, decided to appoint a businessman to the ceremonial role of a Vice-Chancellor. Now, where this role is not about ceremony, Gandalf, where this role is not about ceremony is when they're appointing Vice-Chancellors. So even the Financial Review, the Conservative Financial Review, reported the oddity of this Vice-Chancellor appointment. And RMIT Chancellor at the time, which was Ziggy Sikowski, stated that he and his fellow members of Academic Council selected Bean for the top job in 2015 because, quote, "I find he speaks the language I speak," end of quote. He speaks the language I speak. Sikowski was the former head of Telstra and Optus, so telcos. So Mr. Bean didn't speak like a pesky academic, or even worse, a pesky intellectual. He spoke like a businessman because he was one, and therefore he was suitable for the public service role of Vice-Chancellor and President. The notion that a university has the right and indeed the responsibility to embody the highest levels of knowledge and enable the next generation to sustain and increase those levels of knowledge isn't even in this conversation. And once such people, non-academics, are in positions of leadership, they of course will not hire competent people below them. So they hire the incompetent, so their incompetence is not revealed. That is why, in the last 10 to 20 years, some very, 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 very unusual appointments have been made in our universities. Deans without doctorates and completely research inactive PVCs and DVCs. Academic leaders who hold no educational qualifications of any kind, academic leaders who hold no leadership qualifications at all, academic leaders who maintain a very, very low standard of research activity. So what we've got are academic leaders who construct metrics for other people that they not only are not meeting at the moment, but have never met in their entire career. Now, a couple of my favourite stories that have happened just in the last couple of months. A Vice-Chancellor was appointed by Academic Council without any advertisement or notification of any kind. So simply a Vice-Chancellor put in her resignation, and the next week the Chancellor and the Academic Council appointed somebody else and announced it. No transparent procedure at all. And a great friend of mine, a couple of weeks ago, reported from the United Kingdom a new DVC was announced with the following emailed sentence to all staff. Quote, quote, "After a scoping conversation with stakeholders," you couldn't make this up, I'm just going to say that again, right? Quote, "After a scoping conversation with stakeholders, Professor X has been appointed as our new DVC." End of quote. So employment agencies, those headhunters, are used to construct long lists. So why they do that is they construct a long list so actual academics never get to see the full field. They can remove the competent from the list so the incompetent become from where the post is selected. And remember the weirdness of these corporate employment agencies, right? They're not academics. None of these people have really any academic qualifications of any kind, no research expertise, no teaching expertise, but these are the people that advise Vice-Chancellors, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Provosts and Deans. And they advise about who's appropriate for this academic post, and they're paid a fortune of taxpayers' money to deliver that expertise. This is just amazing, isn't it? Incredible. So what's happened in the last 20 years is we've seen the full flowering of the Peter Principle in higher education, the appointment of a cluster of underperforming people. So once a poor DVC or PVC or Vice-Chancellor is hired, what happens? Are they sort of grateful that they got in there and went, oh, no, they're not grateful, and do they then go on to hire really good people around them so at least their errors and problems can be masked? No, no, no. Instead, they inhibit the career of those that they lead. So how could they hire people that are more intelligent than they are, better teachers than they are, better researchers than they are, more qualified than they are? And the answer is, of course, they don't. They don't hire these people. So remember, whenever any of us may wonder, how did that person get that job? You know, it happens a lot. How did that happen? How was that person promoted, right? And the answer is the Peter Principle. The incompetent are hired, the incompetent are promoted, and the brilliant are not even on the short list. So we got a problem, and that problem was diagnosed in 1969. How we manage that problem, that's our responsibility. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.